Lost Islamic History audiobook by Firas-Alkhateeb, Chapter 5 Part 4. Physics. Mathematics only took Muslim scientists so far. If they truly wanted to understand the principles through which God controls the universe, the ideas formulated by mathematicians had to be applied to the real world. That is where the talented crop of Muslim physicists came in. Like in other fields, Muslim physicists built on earlier advance by ancient civilizations, whose works were translated into Arabic. Drawing on various intellectual traditions, as well as the wide range of sciences that the Muslim world was at the leading edge of, the physicists of the Golden Age developed some of the core concepts of the subject. Their work helped lay the foundation that giants such as Newton and Einstein built upon. One of the primary scientists who contributed to this continuous intellectual tradition was Ibn al-Haytham, who lived from 965 to 1040. He was originally from Iraq, and early in his life he worked as a civil official in the Abbasid government, but soon abandoned the post to join a promising intellectual center in Cairo, the capital of the rival Fatimid Empire. After running afoul of the Fatimid ruler, he was put under house arrest in Cairo, which proved to be a blessing for him and the field of physics itself. While contained within his home, Ibn al-Haytham was able to focus his efforts and studies on light. Since ancient times, the study of light and its properties had perplexed even the brightest minds. One of the leading ideas about light in Ibn al-Haytham's time was promoted by Ptolemy, who argued that light is a ray that is emitted from the eye, bounces off objects, and comes back into the eye, allowing someone to see. The ancient Greek tradition of understanding the world entirely through philosophy ran contrary to the beliefs of Ibn al-Haytham, who advocated that scientific theory be formulated through empirical study and experimentation. Thus, he ran hundreds of experiments on the nature of light. By relying less on philosophy and more on science, he concluded that Ptolemy's theory of light being emitted by the eye was simply impossible. Rather, he theorized that light bounces off every point on an object into the eye, where the numerous rays of light are turned into information that the brain can process. At the same time that Ibn Sina was dissecting eyes in Persia to understand how light travels through them, Ibn al-Haytham was conducting similar experiments in Egypt. After years of hard work, research and experimentation, Ibn al-Haytham wrote a book that was groundbreaking at the time. In his book of optics, Ibn al-Haytham argued that light was composed of rays, which traveled in straight lines. He furthered this idea by building the camera obscura, a device which consists of a light-proof box, through which a tiny hole is punctured. On the wall inside the box opposite the hole, an image depicting whatever the hole is pointing at is projected. He argued that this is only possible if straight rays of light were coming from objects outside the box, were focused by the aperture, and landed on the opposite wall. Ibn al-Haytham lacked the technology necessary to advance his camera obscura a step further into the modern cameras that can capture images today. But without his pioneering study in optics, cameras would not be possible 1000 years later. He also managed to bring together the fields of optics and astronomy in his calculations on the depth of the Earth's atmosphere. Using principles he derived regarding the properties of refracted light, he concluded that at sunset, the color of the sky changes based on the angle at which the sun's rays hit the atmosphere. Based on the colors and the sun's position in relation to the earth at numerous times, he came up with a calculation for the depth of the atmosphere that was not off by much. It was not until spacecraft from the United States and the Soviet Union blasted off into the skies that they were able to verify his calculations. Ibn al-Haytham's scientific achievements can fill volumes on their own, and indeed they did. He reportedly wrote over 200 books, but no more than a few dozen survive today. He pioneered work in magnifying lenses, the laws of motion, analytical geometry, calculus, astronomy, and even experimental psychology. When taking all of his accomplishments together, one can truly appreciate the real legacy of Bin al-Haytham, the scientific method. Today, this method is the technique through which all scientists acquire scientific knowledge. Bin al-Haytham's absolute reliance on observation and experimentation, which we now call the scientific method, separated the sciences from the philosophy of the ancient Greeks. The modern world's understanding of the entire field of science is based on the methods initiated by this intellectual giant. In explaining why he dove so deep into scientific study, Bin al-Haytham concluded, "I constantly sought knowledge and truth. And it became my belief that for gaining access to the effulgence and closeness to God, there is no better way than that of searching for truth and knowledge." After Bin al-Haytham's death, Muslim scientists continued to build on his discoveries and find practical uses for them. New inventions and improvements on old devices were constantly popping up, from improved water clocks to chemistry laboratory equipment. Crankshafts, water pumps, eyeglasses, compasses, gliders, drinking glasses and even water-powered robots all appeared in the Muslim world by the 13th century. The list goes on. What is important to note is that through the advanced study of the sciences, a technological revolution occurred in the Muslim world. When the light began to dim on Muslim scientific creativity, as the Crusaders and the Mongols wreaked havoc on the Muslim heartland in the 12th and 13th centuries, Christian Europe picked it up. There, another scientific revolution was spurred from the works of Copernicus, Galileo and Newton. The list goes on. What is important to note is that through the advanced study of the sciences, a technological revolution occurred in the Muslim world. When the light began to dim on Muslim scientific creativity, as the Crusaders and the Mongols wreaked havoc on the Muslim heartland in the 12th and 13th centuries, Christian Europe picked it up. There, another scientific revolution was spurred from the works of Copernicus, Galileo and Newton, all of whom were familiar with earlier Islamic scientific literature and were almost certainly influenced by it. In the 12th century, a Muslim inventor, Al-Jazari, designed and built numerous automatic machines. Among them were automatic hand-washing systems, clocks and even musical robots powered by water. Fiqh and Hadith. With the development of empirical sciences came the development of the Islamic sciences. Through the in-depth study of the Quran and the actions of the Prophet, scholars began to formulate the field of fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence. Contrary to modern understandings of secular law, fiqh applies to everything from criminal law to how worship should be conducted and what foods are acceptable to eat. The challenge for scholars of fiqh was how to adapt the rules set forth by Muhammad in the early 600s to the dynamic world that Muslim civilization found itself in during the successive centuries. From this challenge, different interpretations of fiqh developed, propagated by different scholars in different places, but all aiming to understand and apply the Quran and prophetic example as authentically as possible. These interpretations became schools of legal thought, known as madhab. The need for interpretations of fiqh developed from the changing nature of Islamic society in the decades after Muhammad's life. The first generation after the Prophet could rely on how they saw him practice, but by the late 600s barely anyone was left who could remember his life and actions. As Islam spread thousands of kilometers in all directions and new converts to Islam began to populate the major cities of the Muslim world, the need arose to interpret Islamic law in a systematic way, facilitating everything from worship to business transactions. As scholars began to address the subject of fiqh in the 8th century, difference of opinion arose regarding what could be considered a source of law. No one disagreed that the Quran and Muhammad's actions, known as the Hadith, were the top two resources to rely on. But what if a subject was not addressed in either of those? Here the jurists differed. The first of these scholars, Abu Hanifa, began promoting the idea that rational logic should play a major role in the development of fiqh. If a topic was not addressed in the Quran or Hadith, he argued, then jurists specially trained in fiqh should exercise their best judgment in coming up with a ruling, basing it on what Muhammad would have done. It is perhaps no surprise that Abu Hanifa's ideas were most popular in Iraq, where the rationalist thinking of Al-Mamun helped establish the House of Wisdom just a few decades later. The second great jurist, Malik, was a contemporary of Abu Hanifa, but lived in Medina, the city where the Prophet himself had lived and preached. Contrary to other scholars of his time, he believed that since most of the people living in Medina at his time were descendants of companions, their actions could be considered a source of law, since they must have learned from their parents, who learned from the Prophet. His rationale in using the traditions of Medina's citizens and strict adherence to the Hadith instead of reason was not accepted by all, but he did build a substantial following, including the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. The third great jurist, Muhammad al-Shafi'i, studied the Hanafi tradition in Iraq and the Maliki tradition in Medina, and was able to build on top of the ideas of both Abu Hanifa and Malik. While he agreed that ijtihad was necessary, he argued that it should only be used when making an analogy between a situation Muhammad addressed and a modern issue. His balanced approach proved very popular and caused him to be hailed as the father of Usul al-Fiqh, the foundation of fiqh. The last of the great jurists, Ahmad bin Hanbal, was a student of al-Shafi'i and tended to lean more towards strict reliance on the hadith than ijtihad. His focus on hadith helped further develop that science, which was perfected under his student, Muhammad al-Bukhari. The wife of the great 15th century scholar of hadith, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, was a scholar in her own right. Anas Khatun regularly gave public lectures that were attended by men and women. Based on the principles set forth by these four jurists, four major madhib of fiqh developed: the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali schools of jurisprudence. These schools were certainly not differing sects within Islam, but rather different interpretations of Islamic law. In the end, they all aimed for the same goal: practicing Islam as authentically as possible even in contexts different from that in which Muhammad lived. Today, these four schools are still followed by over 1 billion Muslims. The Hanafi school is most popular in the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, Turkey, and the Balkans. The Maliki school has prominence in North and West Africa. The Shafi'i school is practiced in the Levant, Egypt, East Africa and Southeast Asia, and the Hanbali, the smallest, is mostly confined to the Arabian Peninsula. In Muslim immigrant communities in Europe and North America, all four schools mingle, leading to new challenges of how to apply Islamic jurisprudence in diverse communities. As a natural outgrowth of the science of fiqh, the study of hadith itself became more prominent in the early Abbasid era. For the most part, sayings of the Prophet were passed down by word of mouth. People would say that they heard from person X, who heard from person Y, who heard from person Z, who heard from a companion, who heard from the Prophet such and such. While it seems that most Muslims did their best to faithfully narrate what they had heard, some doubts began to creep in regarding the authenticity of the hadith corpus as generations passed. There were even claims that some hadith were entirely fabricated to begin with and were never uttered by Muhammad. Into this scholastic fray stepped Muhammad al-Bukhari, who recognized the threat that such doubts about the hadith posed. He was the first to pioneer a scientific approach to determining the authenticity of an individual hadith. Like the pioneering Muslim scientists working at the same time, al-Bukhari refused to accept anything purely on faith and insisted on an empirical, organized method in his analysis. In al-Bukhari's mind, in order for a hadith to be considered authentic, both the wording of the hadith itself and the chain of narrators going back to Muhammad had to be verified. Placing special emphasis on the narrators, al-Bukhari meticulously researched the lives of the people who passed on hadiths. If one person in that chain was known to have ever lied, acted dishonestly or openly disobeyed Islamic law, al-Bukhari would refuse to accept that hadith as authentic. After a life of careful study of the lives of hadith narrators, al-Bukhari compiled an anthology of over 7,000 hadiths which he considered to be entirely authentic. His methods were almost unanimously accepted by Muslim scholars, and his compilation came to be known as Sahih al-Bukhari, meaning the authentic of al-Bukhari. Today, Sahih al-Bukhari is considered by most Muslims to be the most authentic book after the Quran itself. Theology. At its core, Islamic theology is relatively straightforward. It is based on the belief in the absolute unity of God and the finality of Muhammad's message. Belief in this implies acceptance of the Quran as the word of God and the Hadith as divinely inspired guidance. According to traditional Islamic thought, these two sources provided all that was needed for Muslims to live in accordance with the will of God and achieve eternal happiness in paradise. But in the middle of the 8th century, a new approach to religion itself began to emerge. As Muslims translated the scientific texts of ancient Greece, they also translated their philosophical works. A new generation of Muslim philosophers began to believe that rationalism could be used to discover divine truths. In their view, conclusions that they came to using logic and philosophy were on the same level as the Quran itself. Some even posited that logic could override revelation in some cases. This group became known as the Mu'tazila, meaning those who separated, due to their divergence from mainstream Islamic theology. Indeed, their philosophical conclusions were far from mainstream Islamic belief. They advocated that the Quran was not the literal word of God, but rather that it was a creation, just like the created universe. Furthermore, they believed that God is limited by the attributes He is described as having in the Quran. To them, God is not omnipotent. Thus, on the topic of free will versus predestination, they argued in support of absolute free will, even arguing that God Himself cannot control the future and is not aware of what will happen. As Mu'tazili ideas began to spread among intellectual circles, a reaction came from scholars concerned with the theological implications of such ideas. To the more traditional, orthodox-minded Muslims, the Quran and Hadith gave humanity all the truth and guidance it needed, and using philosophy to come up with divine truths was not only unnecessary, but also dangerous. Leading this traditionalist charge in the early 800s was Ahmad bin Hanbal, the same scholar who founded the Hanbali school of fiqh. Despite persecution by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun, who was a major patron of Mu'tazili ideology, bin Hanbal argued in favor of a strict, literal interpretation of the Quran and Hadith when it came to theology. In his mind, there was no room for philosophical reasoning, especially when it led to conclusions that contradicted what the Quran states as true. As such, bin Hanbal advocated that God's attributes should be taken literally and not questioned. So if the Quran says that God is the all-seeing, then God is all-seeing, and no one should try to understand how God sees all or rationalize how it is possible. Bin Hanbal's strict approach to the subject won him followers and managed to slow the spread of Mu'tazili beliefs. But they continued to be popular in academic circles until another approach at combating them arose. Great indeed is the crime against religion committed by anyone who supposes that Islam is to be championed by the denial of mathematical sciences, Imam al-Ghazali say. While the literal approach re-emphasized the authority of the Quran and Hadith in the face of philosophical reasoning, it failed to combat the specific ideas of the Mu'tazila. This changed when the 10th century thinker al-Ash'ari began to advocate a defense of traditional beliefs using reason. While he believed in a literal interpretation of the Quran like bin Hanbal, he believed there was no harm in using philosophical reasoning to defend that interpretation. His approach to theology became known as the Ash'ari school, and his method of rational discourse known as Kalam. Using this framework, traditionalists began to attack individual Mu'tazili arguments using the logic that the Mu'tazila themselves held in such high esteem. The greatest of these traditional-minded scholars was Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who is sometimes credited as the most influential Muslim in history after the Prophet and companions. Having studied both Mu'tazila and Ash'ari thought in depth, he was well versed in the numerous theological arguments back and forth between the two, as well as in various other approaches to religion in general. He argued that one's faith should not be based entirely on philosophical reasoning, but that logic had its place in the defense of traditional ideas when needed. He cautioned, however, against the use of philosophy by those without a firm foundation in traditional Islamic belief. According to his autobiography, he concluded that the true path to God was through absolute obedience to God and purification of the soul from worldly desires. This emphasis on purification was a major focus of the Sufis, a diverse spiritual group insistent on emotional detachment from this world in an effort to achieve nearness to God. Al-Ghazali's work helped finally turn back the tide of the Mu'tazila school, which retreated into oblivion in the centuries after Al-Ghazali. Simultaneously, the Sufism advocated by Al-Ghazali became incredibly popular and became a major movement in almost all Muslim lands. Shiaism. While most of the Muslim world accepted the approaches to fiqh and hadith taken by its leading scholars, a minority rejected them altogether. Their departure from the mainstream Muslim community was originally political, but over time a religious dimension evolved. The group that believed Ali and his descendants had the most right to the caliphate began to develop divergent thoughts on Islamic law and hadith that stemmed from the political differences of the early caliphate. This group called themselves Shi'at Ali, meaning the party of Ali, but is colloquially called the Shia. For the Shia, it all stemmed from the election of Abu Bakr as caliph on the day the Prophet died. In the meeting where Umar historically nominated Abu Bakr and gave an oath of allegiance to him, Ali was absent. While Ali himself accepted Abu Bakr's caliphate, later generations of Shia began to question its legitimacy. In their eyes, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet should have been at that meeting and should have been elected as the first caliph. This led to a belief that Abu Bakr, Umar, and all who supported them were usurpers, who denied the family of the Prophet their rightful role as leaders of the Muslim Ummah. To the Shia, the entire concept of the caliphate was void. Instead, they advocated that the Muslim world should be ruled by a descendant of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima, who was married to Ali. These leaders were dubbed imams. Instead of a caliphate, the Shia promoted an imamate in which only descendants of Ali had the right to rule. The Shia considered Ali as the first imam, while his sons Hassan and Hussein were the second and third, respectively. Even with their belief in an imamate instead of a caliphate, the Shia were not yet a separate sect of Islam. The imamate was simply a political concept which did not automatically have any religious implications. In fact, Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs were commonly referred to as imams as well. In order for the Shia to be considered a religious group instead of just a political one, their arguments about the first caliphs had to go a step further. That step was the idea that if Abu Bakr and his supporters were usurpers, then any hadith narrated by them could not be trusted. This argument carried huge religious implications. People who supported Abu Bakr's caliphate narrated the vast majority of the hadith that was accepted by Muslim scholars. The Prophet's wife Aisha and his neighbor Abu Huraira together accounted for hundreds of the hadith listed in Sahih al-Bukhari. To the Shia, these hadith could not be trusted because of their political support for Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman. To fill the void created by the rejection of thousands of hadith, the Shia elevated the sayings of the Imams to a level just below, or in some cases equal, to the Prophet's sayings. To the rest of the Muslim world, this was blasphemy. But to the Shia, the Imams, due to their special lineage, were infallible interpreters of religion, given special knowledge directly from God. Much of this ideology seems to have been influenced by the Mu'tazili philosophy. Whereas in orthodox approaches to Islam, the idea of humans with a special semi-divine status was unheard of. The Neoplatonic ideas of some of the major philosophers of the early Abbasid age could help the Shia legitimize the imamate from a theological perspective. The main branch of Shi'ism is known as the Ithna Ashariyah, the 12ers, due to their belief that there were 12 imams after Muhammad. According to them, the line of imams ended with Imam Muhammad al-Mahdi, who went into hiding when he was just 5 years old in 874. Thus began the period known as the Minor Occultation, during which special representatives were able to remain in communication with him and receive guidance for the Shia community. In 941, however, it was announced that al-Mahdi had gone into the Greater Occultation, and further communication with the hidden Imam became impossible. The Shia believe that the hidden Imam will only return at the end of time to inaugurate a utopian era under his leadership. Until he returns, however, 12ers insist that guidance can be found in the Quran, the Hadith compilations that they accept as authentic, and the actions and beliefs of the 12 Imams. The 12ers were not the only Shia group to have developed in the turbulent early Abbasid age. Another group believed in only 7 Imams, and thus came to be known as the Sabiya Seveners. The Seveners were much more successful politically than their 12 cousins, and the 10th century saw the rise of major Sevener Shia states in eastern Arabia and Egypt. The smallest of the Shia groups believe in only 5 Imams, and are generally known as the Zadis, due to their acceptance of Hussein's grandson, Zaid, as the final Imam. The Zadis share much in common with mainstream Islam, and are generally much more moderate in their views on the early caliphate than the Seveners and 12ers. Shia ideas never caught on in the way their proponents had hoped. Despite intense vigor in preaching and appeals to Muslim emotion by invoking the conflicts of Ali and Hussein, the majority of the Muslim world did not accept the theological and juristic deviations of Shiism. In fact, for much of the mainstream, majority Muslim body, Shia ideology posed a grave danger to Islam itself. After all, since the beginning the Islamic movement had considered itself unique. The Quran described in detail how previous nations, who were sent prophets, had changed the message and corrupted it to suit their needs, citing Jews and Christians as prime examples. According to Islamic belief, Muhammad had been sent as the final prophet with a pure message that could not be changed or distorted, as previous messages had. When this internal intellectual force began to threaten the sanctity of the Islamic movement, the reaction was largely negative. Besides political persecution by the Abbasid government, mainstream theologians rushed to refute Shia ideology and dubbed themselves Ahl as-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, literally the people who follow the example of the Prophet and the consensus of the community, shortened to Sunni. The most influential of these theologians is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the same al-Ghazali who spent much time refuting the Mu'tazili arguments of the philosophers. With the combination of intellectual arguments and political military defeat of Shia states in the 12th century, Shiism waned in popularity from the 1100s. It was not until the rise of the Safavid Empire in the early 1500s that Shiism would again become a major force in the Muslim world.